Courtney, that was bloody fantastic.
Thank you.
Let me tell you something, Courtney. Something has changed in you. Trust me. In the time you were on the show last year to now, your interaction with the audience, the confidence. I think this has been my favourite performance of you so
Picture
far.
the America's Got Talent stage under those blinding studio lights. The crowd is already on its feet before the song even ends. But the camera doesn't stay on the crowd for long. It cuts to Simon Cowell. He isn't clapping. He rarely does. Yet something about his face says more than applause ever could. His arms are folded, his jaw is tight, and for a few seconds, the man known for crushing dreams with a single word looks like he's been hit by something he didn't see coming. That was the night in 2018 when a 13-year-old from a small town in the north of England changed the way people thought about child performers. Her name was Courtney Hadwin, and within 90 seconds of opening her mouth, she had an entire studio audience for judges, and eventually millions of people online convinced they were watching something rare. Simon took her under his wing. His label got involved. Headlines called her the next big thing. And then, almost as quickly as she'd arrived, she seemed to vanish from the spotlight. Years later, a resurfaced clip appeared online showing Simon Cowell, allegedly, choking up while talking about her, admitting that the industry might have failed her. Whether that clip captures something real or something exaggerated by clever editing and speculation, one thing is certain. Courtney Hadwin's story is far more complicated than a viral audition video could ever show. This is her full story, where she came from, what fame did to her, and where she stands today. Courtney Hadwin was born on July 6, 2004, in Heselden, a small former mining village near Hartlepool in County Durham, in the northeast of England. It's a kind of place where everybody tends to know everybody, where a viral moment feels impossible, and where a girl practicing scales in her bedroom might go entirely unnoticed by the rest of the world. She grew up with her parents, Paul and Anne-Marie, alongside her younger siblings. Music found her early. She sang around the house as a small child, dabbled in musical theater, and experimented with cover songs the way a lot of kids do, except she kept getting better, and people kept noticing. According to Courtney, she started taking singing seriously around age 9 or 10. By the time she was 11, attending a local secondary school, she performed a duet cover at a lunchtime open mic that ended up being filmed and posted online. It spread quickly through her local community. Classmates who thought they knew her were suddenly hearing a completely different voice come out of her, one that sounded far older than her years, rough around the edges, full of soul. Her grandfather later shared that Courtney began busking in public spaces to help pay for her own singing lessons and to help cover the cost of getting to auditions. It wasn't glamorous. She trained at a handful of local performing arts schools and vocal academies around the region, slowly building a technical foundation underneath the raw talent she already had. In 2015, she entered a UK talent competition and made it to the grand final singing a Bob Dylan cover, earning her first real recognition outside her hometown. The following year, at 12 years old, she won a Regional Performer of the Year award and became a finalist in another local talent showcase. That same year, she opened for a major touring act in front of a crowd of roughly 18,000 people at a festival, an enormous audience for someone who had barely started secondary school. By 2017, she'd moved on to a televised singing competition aimed at younger performers, delivering high-energy covers that impressed the coaches enough to advance her deep into the competition, eventually finishing as a finalist. Across all of this, the through line was the same: a girl with an old soul voice, a relentless work ethic, and a family willing to sacrifice time and money to help her chase it. Her father reportedly took on extra work to fund her travel to auditions and lessons. Her mother recognized early on that what she had wasn't just a nice voice. It was something unusual. None of this happened in a vacuum. It happened in small venues, community halls, and open mic nights across northeast England, far from any major music industry hub. And it was that groundwork, years of unglamorous, unpaid performances, that eventually caught the attention of America's Got Talent producers, who were reportedly scouting international talent for the new season. Courtney was invited to audition. Nobody in her family could have predicted just how fast things were about to change. At 13 years old, Courtney Hadwin walked out onto the America's Got Talent stage looking exactly like what she was, a shy, nervous schoolgirl standing under lights far too big for her frame. She barely made eye contact with the judges. If you didn't know better, you might have assumed she'd wandered onto the wrong stage. Then, the music started. The first notes of a classic soul cover hit, and the transformation was immediate. Gone was the timid kid who'd walked through the curtain seconds earlier. In her place was a performer who moved like she'd been doing this for decades. Raspy, powerful vocals, wild stage presence, complete command of the room. The audience, which had been mildly curious moments before, was suddenly on its feet. The judges were stunned. One of them later summed up what everyone in the building was thinking. She'd walked out like a shy little thing, and then she opened her mouth and became something else entirely. Untamed, ferocious, impossible to look away from. Another judge hit the golden buzzer, sending her straight through to the live shows, and compared her voice to some of the greatest blues and soul vocalists of the last century. The clip didn't just do well online, it exploded. Within days it had been viewed by tens of millions of people, and by the time later rounds of the competition aired, that number had climbed into the hundreds of millions. Fans and commentators started using words like generational talent and phenomenon. She advanced through the quarterfinals and semifinals with performances that consistently blurred the line between child performer and seasoned professional. By the finals, she'd built a genuine international fan base. She ultimately placed 6th overall, a result that surprised a lot of people who assumed she was a lock for the top spot. But by any reasonable measure, the placement barely mattered. America's Got Talent had done its job. It had introduced Courtney Hadwin to an American audience and handed her a global platform overnight. She would later return for an all-star spin-off season in 2019, though by then her career had already started moving in a very different direction. Shortly after her original season wrapped, the label associated with one of the show's judges signed her to a recording deal and partnership with a major record label. At 13 years old, a girl from a mining village in County Durham was suddenly, officially, a signed recording artist. It felt on paper like the fairy tale ending. In reality, it was only the beginning of the hardest chapter of her young life. Fame doesn't arrive gently, and for Courtney, it didn't arrive gradually either. It arrived all at once. Her audition played on talk shows, news broadcasts, and entertainment segments around the world. Headlines reached for comparisons to legendary vocalists. Almost overnight, she went from a locally known singer in Northeast England to a name recognized by strangers on other continents. Then, in December of that year, at just 14 years old, Courtney signed a long-term recording and publishing contract with a major label partnership. In interviews around the announcement, she talked about how amazing it felt, how excited she was to write original music and stay true to herself. It read, at the time, like a dream coming true. What she couldn't have fully understood at 14 was the weight that came attached to that contract. She was still a teenager figuring out how to exist on a stage, and now she was expected to produce chart-ready music, sit through endless interviews, and appear at promotional events, all inside an industry built for adults, running at a pace built for adults. Behind the scenes, the pressure compounded fast. She needed to deliver a big performance not once, but week after week, carrying real expectations each time. Record executives began shaping her into a marketable package, pitching her sound, her image, her onstage persona. The comparisons to iconic vocalists were flattering, but they were also a trap, a mold she was expected to fit rather than an identity she got to shape herself. At 14, she was sitting in studio sessions with songwriting teams and producers who were steering her toward a polished, radio-friendly sound, while she was still trying to figure out what she actually wanted to sound like. She later described the feeling plainly, that people around her were telling her who she should be, and that she felt like she'd lost the thread of her own path somewhere in the middle of all those sessions. She was shuttling constantly between the UK and the US, expected to record, film promotional content, and stay camera-ready at all times. For a young teenager still living with her family, it was disorienting. Fan comments and view counts kept climbing, but underneath the praise, she was quietly struggling to feel like she had any real control over her own career. The industry, for its part, kept up its enthusiasm publicly. Coverage praised her energy and stage presence, describing her as a force of nature. But privately, by her own later admission, she sometimes felt like a character being directed rather than an artist expressing herself, even in sessions for songs that were technically her own. She has spoken about sitting through session after session built around themes and sounds she didn't fully connect with, quietly asking herself whether the music reflected who she actually was or who other people wanted her to be. There's a particular kind of exhaustion that comes from being handed enormous opportunity before you're old enough to fully process it. Courtney wasn't ungrateful for what she'd been given. She has said as much herself, but the pace of it all became genuinely overwhelming. Once she signed with the label, her life turned into a cycle of deadlines, meetings, and recording sessions. It wasn't songwriting on her own timeline. It was closer to an assembly line built to produce hits on a schedule. For someone who'd found joy in the small, unpressured act of creating music, that shift was jarring. She was 14 years old, moving through back-to-back sessions, expected to deliver polished, radio-ready tracks within tight windows. A single day might start with breakfast at home in the UK, move into label meetings by early afternoon, and end with a long-haul flight to a studio session in the United States that evening. Multiple producers would pitch beats, hooks, and concepts that didn't always resonate with her. She later reflected that it felt like everyone around her had an opinion about who she should become, and that her own creative instincts were consistently overshadowed by industry voices with more experience and more authority. As the co-writing sessions piled up, she began to feel increasingly detached from the songs carrying her name. In later interviews, she expressed real frustration about being molded into a sound that didn't match her instincts. Polished pop production layered over vocals that had built their reputation on grit and rawness. She was still discovering who she was as an artist, and she was being asked to conform before that discovery had even really started. That tension wore down her confidence over time. What had once felt joyful started to feel like a job she hadn't fully agreed to. Her voice sounded like it belonged to someone twice her age, but her mind was still very much that of a teenager trying to keep up. She's described the mental exhaustion of closing out live shows week after week, carrying the emotional weight of a finale performance while trying to hold herself together behind the scenes. Even with support from people around her, she's admitted to feeling isolated, bouncing between countries, surrounded by industry professionals, missing the ordinary parts of home life. That's when the public withdrawal began. It happened gradually rather than all at once. Her social media activity slowed down. Her presence on mainstream entertainment coverage shrank. Fans noticed, and speculation started to fill in the gaps that an absence of updates left behind. Was there a falling out? Was she unwell? Nobody had a clear answer, because Courtney simply wasn't offering one publicly. In reality, she wasn't gone. She was stepping back to protect whatever sense of herself she had left. Around this time, she began teasing future material that sounded noticeably different, angrier, more honest, less polished. Lines hinting at feeling valued only when she performed a certain way suggested there was more going on beneath the surface than the industry narrative had been letting on. As the years passed, the entertainment machine kept moving, the way it always does. New seasons of the show that made her famous kept airing. New acts kept getting discovered. And the connection between Courtney and the judge who'd signed her to his label quietly faded into the background, the way most industry relationships eventually do once the cameras move on. It's worth being honest about what that relationship actually was. From the outside, it might have looked like mentorship, a seasoned judge taking a promising young talent under his wing. But by most accounts, it was closer to a business arrangement than a personal one. He was the executive who spotted her, signed her, and appeared at the announcements. Beyond that, the day-to-day emotional weight of navigating fame as a teenager was never really his responsibility to carry, and there's little evidence he treated it as such. Courtney has never spoken publicly with any real bitterness about that dynamic. If anything, by most accounts she seemed to understand, even at a young age, that the industry runs on talent spotting, not emotional caretaking. Still, in hindsight, the absence of any real follow-through says something about how she was treated during that period. As a product to be positioned, rather than a young artist to be nurtured through a genuinely difficult transition. During these quieter years, she began building relationships with independent producers, most notably Kevin Bowe, a Grammy-winning producer known for his work with major blues and soul artists. That relationship would end up being pivotal later on. Publicly, though, it looked like she'd simply disappeared. Meanwhile, the show and its judges carried on exactly as before, with no real public acknowledgement of what she might have been going through or whether the system around young performers needed any kind of rethink. Despite all of it, Courtney never actually stopped loving music. She kept writing. She kept recording, slowly and mostly outside of the spotlight, rebuilding her relationship with the craft on terms she could actually live with. There's a specific kind of relief that comes from reclaiming something that felt like it had been taken from you. By the mid-2020s, Courtney re-emerged as a very different artist than the one people remembered from her AGT run, older, more grounded, and working entirely on her own terms. After stepping away from her earlier label arrangement, she committed to being an independent artist, with creative ownership as her top priority. Her partnership with producer Kevin Bowe became the foundation of this new chapter. Together they wrote and recorded music that leaned into honesty rather than radio polish, songs exploring vulnerability, anger, resilience, and identity. Among the tracks to come out of this period were pieces built around themes of emotional exhaustion, self-discovery, and reclaiming a sense of control after years of feeling like she didn't have any. In interviews from this period, she's talked about how different the process felt without label deadlines dictating the pace or shape of her work. She's described the shift plainly. For years, everyone around her seemed to have an opinion about who she should be, and now, for the first time in a long time, she actually knows who she is as an artist. She's referred to this period as something close to a rebirth, a conscious decision to make music that reflects her real experiences rather than a version of herself designed for mass appeal. Fans and critics responded warmly to the new material, praising its emotional rawness and the sense that they were finally hearing the real Courtney rather than a curated version of her. Reviewers described her newer work as some of the most emotionally powerful material she's released, carrying the weight of hidden pain alongside the courage it took to put it into words. Now in her 20s, Courtney has become noticeably more open about the toll her early fame took on her, touching on burnout, the loss of creative control, and the pressure of being expected to perform at a professional level before she was emotionally ready for it. She's spoken about grappling with her own identity under the weight of industry expectations, and how the process of reclaiming her artistic voice has felt inseparable from reclaiming her sense of personal strength. Now about the resurfaced clip that's driven a wave of headlines and speculation, including the framing behind this very video's title. Several viral clips and retrospective compilations circulating online have claimed that the judge who signed her broke his usual composure while discussing her career, allegedly admitting that the industry pushed her too far, too fast, and that he felt they'd failed her as a kid caught in a system built for adults. It's a compelling narrative, and it fits the emotional arc of her story almost too neatly. But it's important to be upfront here. No major outlet or credentialed journalist has verified that this moment happened as described. It exists primarily in edited clips and secondhand retellings across social media, the kind of content that spreads quickly precisely because it feels satisfying, whether or not it's accurate. It's entirely possible the moment is real and simply undercovered by mainstream press. It's also possible it's an exaggeration, a misattributed quote, or a piece of speculative editing designed to generate views. As of now, there's no confirmed, sourced instance of him saying those exact words on record. What is true is that he's aware of her current career path, and that her music since going independent has often read like an indirect response to everything she experienced during those early years, regardless of whether he's ever addressed it directly himself.